What's going on, everyone? I'm going to be teaching you about the useState hook in React. If you are new to React or new to functional React components, this video is definitely geared for you. Before we can start talking about the useState hook though, we need to first understand what component state actually means. In most web applications, we have a need to keep track of how the user has interacted with the application and how it changes based on what you've done in those interactions. So one pretty good example of state would be like deciding when to hide or show a drop-down menu. So in this example, notice how I hover over a drop-down item in the header and it drops down and shows another div. This is a really good example of application state, and I know you could achieve this with CSS, but nonetheless, it's still a good example. Another great example of application state would be keeping track of when you need to hide or display a modal. So in this example, I'm on the Bootstrap website, and if a user clicks on a button here, it's going to kind of change some internal state. Maybe it's like a Boolean or a flag, and that flag is going to determine if a modal should show or not. So those are two really basic, really simple examples of application state, component state, and that is what the useState hook is going to be used for. So now that we understand what state is and what application component state is and how it's used, let's go ahead and look at a really basic example, which is the button counting example. And this example is used on many other frameworks like Vue, React, Angular to kind of demonstrate how you'd use state and bind to state on your components. So as you can see, we have a button, and every time you click on it, it basically updates some internal state by incrementing a counter by 1, and we display that text inside of the button component itself. Now, if we look at the HTML with a static button, the functional React component that we're looking at here is really straightforward. We just have a button. Inside of it, we have some text, and then we have some italics with the hard-coded 1. And what we want to do is kind of import libraries to change this functional component to use state. So in order to use this hook, you have to first import it directly from the React component. And this is going to be a named import. So if we just do the curly braces and say use state and import it at the top, we can then call it inside of a React component. The second thing we can do is, now that we have the ability to call the useState function, inside our functional component itself, we can invoke the useState method, and that's going to take an initial argument. That's going to be your initial state. So you can pass in an integer, a string, or an object, etc. And that is basically going to return you an array that has 2 elements. The first index of that array is going to be your actual state variable that you can use to display inside your component using JSX. And your second element in the array is going to be a setter function that you can use to kind of manipulate and change the state when a user clicks on a button or types into an input box. Now, if you're unaware of the syntax where we do basically brackets equals a function, this is just array destructuring, which is an ES6 construct. If you don't know about that, I would definitely recommend looking it up and reading about it. But it's just a shorthand way to basically taking the first and second elements of the array and putting them directly inside variable. So now that we actually have a state variable called count, we obviously want to render it out to the screen. So we can do that using JSX. And if you see, I replaced the 1 with some curly braces and put count. And that'll basically render out the state variable to the screen. And the final step to actually change the state is add an onClick event listener to the button itself and basically invoke an anonymous function that calls the setCount setter function and increments that count by 1. So that was a really basic example, right? So the counter button example is pretty straightforward and simple, but I would like to actually show something a little bit more complex. So let's say we have a registration form where you have 2 input boxes, an email and a password. And basically when a user types into those input boxes, you want to update some state, right? So in this case, the state that we're keeping track of, it would make sense to maybe store an object. So if you see here on our useState, we pass an initial state, which is an object that has an email and password property set to an empty string. And whenever we type into the input box, we basically just call a function which is going to update the state's key, depending on if it was an email or a password that was typed in. We have this function called update form, which is just a factory function that takes in a key and returns another function that's basically going to update whatever value is that you want it to. So it's a little bit complex if you're a beginner, but it's a little helpful utility to basically update your state's form based on whatever key that you want. So now that we covered the basics of the useState hook, I do want to talk about a couple of pitfalls that you might encounter. The first one is you need to make sure that you only ever call the useState hook function inside your functional components. If you were to accidentally call that inside like a classical class component, or if you call it outside of your functional component, it's not going to work. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is, let's say you want to call your setter function multiple times inside of your React code. So if we look at this example here, we call set count 3 times, and looking at it from the outside in, it seems like it makes sense, right? We just, increment count by 1, and then you call set count again, and you'd think that count would already be incremented to 1. But the way this works behind the scenes is every time you call the setter function, it actually pushes an action onto an internal array. So this is actually just going to ultimately just keep incrementing your count by 1, and instead we'd actually want it to increment by 3 every time you click on the button. So to resolve this issue, you actually want to use a callback function on your set count setter function. And this is really simple. I mean, basically it's just a function that takes in your current state value, and you need to return your new state value. So in this case, it's a function that takes in count, and we basically return count plus 1. So now when we click on the button increments by 3 every time, and that is the actual desired functionality we want. Now, the last pitfall I want to talk about is you need to make sure you never call the useState hook inside a conditional, right? You should not call this inside a for loop or a while loop. You should not call it inside a switch statement or an if statement. And basically, again, the internals of hooks, it uses an ordered list, so an ordered array. And if you conditionally not call the useState in the correct order, every time, you're going to see issues. And luckily, React will throw an error if you do something like this. So these are just some common pitfalls that you might need to know about, and I'm sure there's a couple of others, but these are the main ones. All in all, I hope you understand the useState hook at this point. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns about this video, be sure to post it in the comments below. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and also be sure to subscribe if you're not already a subscriber to this Web Dev Junkie channel. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Cody Seibert, and have a great day.